Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had always been different from other women in the Navy. At 28, she stood tall with confident shoulders and eyes that seemed to see right through people's pretenses. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a perfect regulation bun, and her uniform pressed so crisp it could cut glass. But what really set her apart wasn't her appearance or even her impressive service record, it was her mouth. Sarah had a way with words that could make seasoned sailors blush and commanding officers think twice before crossing her. She'd earned her reputation the hard way, climbing through the ranks in a world where women still had to prove themselves twice as hard as men. Every promotion came with whispers behind her back. Every assignment brought new challenges from people who thought she didn't belong. The USS Constellation was her current home, a massive destroyer cutting through the Pacific waters on what seemed like another routine patrol. But nothing was ever truly routine when you served under Admiral Richard Hawthorne. The man was a legend in the Navy, known for his brilliant tactical mind and his complete lack of patience for what he called modern sensitivities. He'd been commanding ships since before Sarah was born, and he made sure everyone knew it. Admiral Hawthorne was the kind of old-school military man who believed the Navy had gone soft. He complained constantly about political correctness, diversity training, and what he saw as the feminization of the armed forces. At 62, with steel-gray hair and a face weathered by decades at sea, he commanded respect through intimidation and tradition. His officers feared him, his crew obeyed without question, and his superiors mostly left him alone because he got results. The tension between the Admiral and the younger generation of officers was always there, simmering just below the surface. Sarah had felt his disapproving gaze more than once during briefings, seen the way his jaw tightened when she spoke up with suggestions or corrections. She knew he tolerated her presence because she was damn good at her job, but she also knew he was waiting for her to slip up, to prove his point about women in combat roles. The incident that would change everything started on a Tuesday morning in the ship's wardroom. The senior officers had gathered for their weekly briefing, discussing navigation routes, supply schedules, and intelligence reports. The conversation was routine, professional, exactly what you'd expect from experienced military personnel going about their duties. Sarah had just finished presenting an analysis of potential weather patterns that could affect their mission timeline. She'd done her homework as always, consulting multiple meteorological sources and running probability calculations that impressed even the skeptical chief navigator. Her report was thorough, clear, and potentially saved the ship from running into a dangerous storm system. As the meeting began to wind down, the atmosphere started to relax. Some of the officers began discussing their upcoming shore leave, sharing stories about family and friends waiting for them back home. It was these moments of casual conversation that often revealed more about the crew's dynamics than any formal interaction. Commander Williams, the ship's executive officer, mentioned his daughter's upcoming graduation from college. Lieutenant Commander Peterson talked about his son's baseball season. The conversation drifted naturally from family to relationships, from serious topics to lighter observations about life aboard ship. That's when Admiral Hawthorne decided to join the conversation in his own particular way. He'd been listening quietly, occasionally nodding or grunting approval at various comments. But as the talk turned to relationships and dating, something seemed to spark his interest. Maybe it was the casual atmosphere, or maybe he'd been planning this moment for weeks. Either way, what happened next would be talked about in Navy circles for years to come. The Admiral's eyes settled on Sarah with the kind of look that made seasoned sailors nervous. She was gathering her papers, preparing to leave for her next duty shift, when his voice cut through the room's comfortable chatter like a knife through silk. "Martinez," he said, and the casual conversation died instantly. Every officer in the room turned to look, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Sarah looked up from her papers, meeting his gaze directly. She'd learned long ago that showing weakness or backing down from confrontation only made things worse. "Yes, Admiral?" she replied, her voice steady and professional. But inside, warning bells were starting to ring. She'd seen that look before, usually right before someone tried to put her in what they considered her proper place. Admiral Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of expression a predator wears right before pouncing on prey. The other officers in the room seemed to sense it too, because the atmosphere grew thick with tension. "I was just thinking," the Admiral said slowly, drawing out each word for maximum effect. "We've been talking about relationships and family, and I realized I don't know much about the personal lives of my officers, especially the younger ones." Sarah felt every eye in the room on her. She knew this wasn't going to be a friendly inquiry about her hobbies or hometown. Admiral Hawthorne had a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions, for pushing boundaries just to see how people would react. She braced herself for whatever was coming. "For instance," the Admiral continued, his voice taking on a mock casual tone that fooled no one, "I'm curious about your experience level, Martinez. Your, shall we say, body count?" The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Commander Williams looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. The younger lieutenants stared at their hands, clearly uncomfortable with where this was headed. But Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't blush, didn't stammer, didn't give the Admiral the reaction he was clearly hoping for. Instead, she set down her papers very deliberately and looked him straight in the eye. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap. Everyone in the room understood exactly what the Admiral was asking. In military slang, body count usually referred to enemy casualties in combat. But the way he'd phrased it, the context of the conversation, and the smirk on his face made his true meaning crystal clear. He was asking about her sexual history, reducing a highly decorated officer to nothing more than a collection of intimate encounters. It was inappropriate. It was sexist. It was probably a violation of several military regulations regarding respectful workplace conduct. But it was also typical Admiral Hawthorne, pushing boundaries and testing limits to see who would stand up to him and who would crumble under pressure. Sarah had a choice to make. She could report the incident through proper channels, file a complaint, and hope the military bureaucracy would eventually address the Admiral's behavior. She could deflect with humor, try to laugh it off and change the subject. She could even just ignore the question entirely and leave the room. But Sarah Martinez hadn't gotten where she was by backing down from bullies, even when those bullies wore Admiral stars on their uniforms. She'd spent years dealing with men who thought they could intimidate her with crude comments and inappropriate questions. She'd developed her own methods for handling such situations, and Admiral Hawthorne was about to get a masterclass in why you don't mess with someone who spent their career fighting for respect in a male-dominated world. The other officers waited, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Some looked embarrassed by their commanding officer's behavior. Others seemed curious to see how Sarah would handle the situation. A few appeared to be holding their breath, knowing that whatever happened next would ripple through the ship's social hierarchy for months to come. Sarah took a deep breath, not out of nervousness, but to center herself for what she was about to do. She'd been preparing for this moment without realizing it. Every snide comment and inappropriate joke she'd endured over the years, building toward this confrontation. Admiral Hawthorne thought he was dealing with just another young officer who would be easily flustered by his crude humor. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The clock on the wardroom wall ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, the ship's engines hummed their constant rhythm, pushing the USS Constellation through the Pacific waters. Inside the wardroom, 12 of the Navy's finest officers waited to see what would happen when an unstoppable force met an immovable object. Sarah's response would shock everyone present, including herself. It would become legendary throughout the fleet, whispered about in mess halls and repeated in officer training courses as an example of quick thinking under pressure. But more than that, it would fundamentally change how people saw her, how they treated her, and how she saw herself. Admiral Hawthorne had asked his question expecting to embarrass and diminish a young female officer. Instead, he was about to discover that Lieutenant Sarah Martinez was not someone to be underestimated, and that sometimes the person you're trying to intimidate has been waiting their entire career for the perfect moment to turn the tables. The stage was set. The question had been asked, and Sarah Martinez was about to give an answer that would be remembered long after both she and Admiral Hawthorne had left the Navy forever. Sarah looked at Admiral Hawthorne for a long moment, her expression completely calm. The silence in the wardroom stretched until it became almost unbearable. Then, without breaking eye contact, she spoke in a voice that was perfectly professional, completely controlled, and absolutely devastating. "Well, Admiral, if we're talking about my body count in the traditional military sense, I have 17 confirmed kills from my 3 deployments in active combat zones. But if you're asking about my personal life, I'm not sure why that would be relevant to my performance as an officer, or appropriate discussion in a professional military briefing.
The words hit the room like a physical blow.
Admiral Hawthorne's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of shock that quickly shifted to embarrassment, then to anger. The other officers sat frozen, torn between admiration for Sarah's brilliant response and terror at what the Admiral might do next. Sarah wasn't finished. She continued in the same calm professional tone, as if she were delivering a routine status report rather than systematically dismantling her commanding officer's attempt to humiliate her. However, since you brought up combat experience, I should mention that those 17 confirmed kills were achieved during my tours in Afghanistan and Syria, where I served as a forward reconnaissance specialist. 3 of those engagements resulted in intelligence gathering that prevented attacks on civilian populations. 2 more led to the successful extraction of wounded American personnel who might otherwise have been lost. Commander Williams cleared his throat nervously, clearly wanting to intervene but not sure how. Lieutenant Commander Peterson stared at his coffee cup like it held the secrets of the universe. The younger officers looked back and forth between Sarah and the Admiral like they were watching a tennis match, where one player had suddenly started using a rocket launcher instead of a racket. Admiral Hawthorne's face was turning red, but Sarah pressed on relentlessly. Her voice never wavered, never lost its professional tone, but somehow managed to carry the force of a sledgehammer with each carefully chosen word. Of course, if we want to expand the definition of body count to include non-combat situations where lives were saved through quick action and tactical thinking, the number would be considerably higher. There was the search and rescue operation off the coast of Somalia where my navigation skills helped locate a downed helicopter crew. Then there was the incident in the South China Sea where I identified and neutralized a potential security breach that could have compromised operational security for our entire battle group. The Admiral opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah smoothly continued, as if she hadn't noticed his attempt to interrupt. It was a masterful display of verbal warfare, using military protocol and professional courtesy as weapons against someone who had stepped far outside the bounds of both. I've also been involved in humanitarian missions that resulted in the successful evacuation of civilians from disaster areas. The earthquake response in Haiti added another 43 people to what you might call my save count. The typhoon relief efforts in the Philippines brought that number up significantly. So depending on exactly how you want to define body count, Admiral, the answer could vary quite a bit. By now, Admiral Hawthorne looked like a man who had grabbed what he thought was a harmless house cat, only to discover he'd actually picked up a Bengal tiger. His face had moved through several shades of red and was heading toward purple. The other officers were trying very hard to look anywhere except at their commanding officer's face. But Sarah still wasn't done. She had spent years absorbing crude comments, inappropriate jokes, and demeaning questions from men who thought they could reduce her to nothing more than a sexual object. Now she had the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly why that was a mistake, and she was going to make the most of it. I should also mention, sir, that my body count includes the number of training exercises where I've successfully completed objectives ahead of schedule and under budget. The War Games simulation last year, for example, where my tactical planning resulted in a complete victory for our forces with 0 simulated casualties. Or the joint training operation with the Marines, where my intelligence analysis prevented what would have been a catastrophic strategic error. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder with each passing second. Outside, seagulls called to each other as they followed the ship's wake, completely unaware that inside the wardroom, a legendary confrontation was taking place. The USS Constellation continued its course through the Pacific, its routine patrol mission now interrupted by a battle of wits that would be remembered for decades. Admiral Hawthorne finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual commanding bark. "Martinez, that's not what I meant, and you know it." Sarah tilted her head slightly, as if she were genuinely confused by his statement. "I'm sorry, Admiral, but could you clarify exactly what you did mean? Because in my experience, when military personnel discuss body count, they're typically referring to combat effectiveness, mission success rates, or lives saved through professional competence. If you meant something else, I'm afraid I don't understand the question." It was a perfect trap, and Admiral Hawthorne had walked right into it. He couldn't clarify what he'd actually meant without making his inappropriate intent even more obvious. He couldn't retreat from the question without looking weak in front of his officers. And he couldn't continue the line of inquiry without digging himself deeper into a hole that was already threatening to swallow his career. The other officers watched in fascination as their commanding officer struggled to find a way out of the situation he'd created for himself. Some were clearly enjoying the spectacle of seeing the Admiral get a taste of his own medicine. Others looked worried about the potential consequences of this confrontation. All of them recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Lieutenant Rodriguez, one of the younger officers, later told his friends that watching Sarah dismantle Admiral Hawthorne was like watching a surgeon perform a delicate operation. Every word was precisely placed, every pause perfectly timed, every response calculated for maximum impact while maintaining complete plausible deniability. Sarah continued to stand at attention, her posture perfect, her expression politely attentive, as if she were simply waiting for further orders from her commanding officer. But everyone in the room could sense the steel beneath her professional facade. This was not a woman who would be intimidated, demeaned, or pushed around by anyone, regardless of their rank or position. The Admiral's attempts to regain control of the situation only made things worse.
You know damn well what I was asking about, Martinez. Don't try to play word games with me. Sir, I assure you, I'm not playing any games.
I'm simply trying to understand your question so I can provide an accurate and helpful response. If you're asking about my combat record, my mission success rate, or my contributions to Navy operations, I'm happy to provide detailed statistics. If you're asking about something else, perhaps you could rephrase the question in more specific military terms? The beauty of Sarah's response was that she had turned the Admiral's own crude behavior against him while never stepping outside the bounds of military protocol herself. She had used his inappropriate question as a launching pad to showcase her impressive professional accomplishments while simultaneously making it impossible for him to pursue his original line of inquiry without explicitly admitting to sexual harassment. Commander Williams finally found the courage to intervene, clearing his throat loudly and glancing at his watch. Admiral, if I may, we do have the navigation briefing scheduled for 1100 hours, and Lieutenant Martinez needs to prepare her weather analysis update. It was a lifeline, offering both Sarah and the Admiral a graceful way to exit the confrontation. But Admiral Hawthorne, his pride wounded and his authority challenged, wasn't ready to back down. He had built his career on never showing weakness, never admitting error, and never letting subordinates get the upper hand in any situation.
The briefing can wait, he growled, his eyes still locked on Sarah's face.
I want to finish this conversation first. Sarah nodded respectfully, as if she were perfectly willing to continue standing there all day discussing her professional accomplishments. Of course, sir. Would you like me to break down my combat statistics by deployment? I can provide detailed after-action reports for each engagement, if that would be helpful. The trap was tightening around Admiral Hawthorne like quicksand. The more he struggled to regain control of the situation, the deeper he sank into professional embarrassment. His officers were watching him lose a battle of wits to a subordinate, and everyone in the room knew it. The story would spread through the ship within hours, throughout the fleet within days. But the most damaging part wasn't that Admiral Hawthorne was losing the confrontation. It was that Sarah was winning it without ever abandoning her role as a professional military officer. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't shown disrespect, hadn't violated any regulations or protocols. She had simply responded to an inappropriate question with such skill and precision that she had turned it into a showcase of her own competence and dedication. Years later, when naval historians studied this incident as an example of effective leadership under pressure, they would note that Sarah Martinez had accomplished something remarkable. She had faced down a commanding officer's attempt to humiliate her without ever stepping outside the bounds of military discipline. She had turned defense into offense, reaction into action, and a moment of potential humiliation into a demonstration of professional excellence. The confrontation in the wardroom was far from over, but the tide had already turned decisively in Sarah's favor. Admiral Hawthorne had asked his crude question expecting to embarrass a young female officer. Instead, he had created a situation where his own behavior was on trial, while Sarah's impressive record of service was on full display for everyone to admire. What happened next would cement Sarah's reputation as someone not to be underestimated, while simultaneously raising serious questions about Admiral Hawthorne's fitness for command. The body count question would become a cautionary tale told in military leadership courses, a reminder that respect is earned through competence and character, not demanded through rank and intimidation. Admiral Hawthorne stared at Sarah for what felt like an eternity, his face cycling through various shades of red as he tried to find a way to salvage the situation. The wardroom had become so quiet that everyone could hear the distant sounds of sailors going about their duties on the decks above. Finally he spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Martinez, you think you're very clever, don't you?" Deleted in the same calm. To delegate to the associates of heteroception. Delivered in the same calm, professional tone she'd maintained throughout the entire exchange. "Sir, I think I'm a competent naval officer who takes pride in my service record. If that comes across as cleverness, then I suppose I'm grateful for the compliment." The other officers in the room exchanged glances that ranged from admiration to terror. They all knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Lieutenant Commander Peterson later said it was like watching a master chess player calmly announce checkmate while their opponent was still trying to figure out how the game had turned against them. Admiral Hawthorne's jaw worked silently for a moment, as if he were trying to chew through the words he wanted to say. Then, apparently deciding that discretion might be the better part of valor after all, he stood abruptly from his chair. "This briefing is dismissed," he announced curtly. "All officers return to your duties immediately." But as the other officers began to gather their papers and file out of the wardroom, the Admiral added one more comment that would prove to be a significant mistake. "Martinez, a word of advice. In the Navy, we value team players, not smart-mouthed show-offs who think they're too good for their commanding officers." Sarah had been preparing to leave with the others, but she stopped at the Admiral's words. When she turned back to face him, something had changed in her expression. The polite professionalism was still there, but now it was backed by something harder, more dangerous. "With respect, Admiral, I believe the Navy values competence, integrity, and dedication to duty above all else. Those are the principles I've tried to embody throughout my service, and they're the same principles that led to my commendations for excellence in combat operations, my promotion ahead of schedule, and my selection for this assignment." She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "As for being a team player, I think my record speaks for itself. I've served under 7 different commanding officers in my career, and every one of them has rated my performance as exemplary. I've mentored junior officers, led successful missions, and consistently put the needs of my unit above my own personal interests." Admiral Hawthorne's face was now approaching a dangerous shade of purple, but Sarah wasn't finished. She had clearly decided that if he wanted to make this about her character and fitness as an officer, she was prepared to have that conversation in full. "If my response to your question seemed disrespectful, Admiral, I apologize. However, I would respectfully suggest that asking about an officer's personal, intimate relationships during a professional briefing might not be the most effective way to build team cohesion or maintain military discipline." The words hung in the air like a bombshell with its fuse lit. Sarah had just done something that few officers in the history of the Navy had ever dared to do. She had directly called out a superior officer's inappropriate behavior, while maintaining perfect military protocol throughout the entire exchange. Commander Williams, who had been trying to edge toward the door, froze in place. The remaining officers looked like they wanted to disappear into the deck plating. Everyone in the room understood that they had just witnessed a defining moment, not just for Sarah and Admiral Hawthorne, but for the entire ship's command structure. Admiral Hawthorne's response came in a voice that was dangerously quiet. "Are you questioning my leadership, Lieutenant? I'm simply pointing out that your question about my body count could be interpreted in ways that might not reflect the professional standards we're all expected to maintain. I chose to interpret it in the most professionally appropriate way possible, which I believe is what any dedicated officer would do in similar circumstances." It was a masterful final stroke. Sarah had managed to acknowledge the Admiral's authority while simultaneously making it clear that his behavior had been inappropriate and that her response had been not only justified, but actually demonstrated superior professional judgment. The standoff continued for several more seconds, with Admiral Hawthorne clearly trying to decide whether to escalate the confrontation further or find a way to retreat with whatever dignity he had left. Finally, perhaps recognizing that he had already lost more than he could afford in this exchange, he made the only choice available to him. "Dismissed," he said curtly, turning away from Sarah and pretending to study some papers on the table. But as Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave, Admiral Hawthorne made one final error in judgment. Perhaps he couldn't resist getting the last word, or Perhaps his wounded pride demanded some form of retaliation. Whatever the reason, he called out as she reached the door. "Oh, and Martinez? Make sure your next performance evaluation includes a note about your attitude problem." Sarah stopped with her hand on the door handle. For a moment, everyone in the room thought she might finally lose her composure. Instead, she turned back one last time, with a smile that was somehow more intimidating than any display of anger could have been. "Of course, Admiral, and I'm sure my performance evaluation will also include notes about my combat record, my mission success rate, my leadership capabilities, and my commitment to upholding the highest standards of military professionalism. I'm confident that my superior officers will be able to evaluate all aspects of my service record in their proper context." With that, she left the wardroom, leaving behind a group of stunned officers and one very embarrassed admiral who was only beginning to realize the full implications of what had just occurred. The story of the admiral's question and Sarah's response spread through the USS Constellation like wildfire. By evening, every sailor on the ship had heard some version of the tale. Within a week, it had reached other ships in the fleet through the informal communication networks that connect military personnel across the globe. The reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Sailors who had served under demanding or inappropriate commanding officers saw Sarah as a hero who had stood up for every service member who had ever been subjected to unprofessional behavior. Women in the military, in particular, viewed her response as a masterclass in how to handle sexual harassment without sacrificing career prospects. But the story didn't end with shipboard gossip. Admiral Hawthorne's threat about Sarah's performance evaluation proved to be his final mistake in a series of increasingly poor decisions. When the evaluation was submitted, it contained several negative comments about Sarah's attitude and inability to respect authority. However, the evaluation also had to include objective measures of performance, mission success rates, peer evaluations, subordinate feedback, and concrete accomplishments. On every measurable criterion, Sarah's performance was exceptional. The disconnect between the Admiral's subjective complaints and the objective evidence of her excellence was so stark that it raised immediate red flags with the review board. An investigation was quietly launched not into Sarah's conduct, but into the circumstances that had led to such contradictory evaluation results. When investigators interviewed other officers who had been present during the wardroom incident, the full story emerged. Admiral Hawthorne's inappropriate question, Sarah's professional response, and his subsequent retaliation attempt all became part of the official record. The investigation's findings were damaging to Admiral Hawthorne's career and vindication for Sarah's approach to the situation. The review board determined that the Admiral had violated several regulations regarding professional conduct and had attempted to use the performance evaluation system as a tool for personal retaliation. Admiral Hawthorne was quietly transferred to a desk job at the Pentagon, where his interactions with junior officers could be more closely supervised. His chances for further promotion were effectively ended, and he retired from the Navy within 2 years of the incident. Sarah, meanwhile, became something of a celebrity within military circles. Her story was used in leadership training courses as an example of how to maintain professionalism under pressure. She was invited to speak at military academies and officer training programs about handling inappropriate behavior in the workplace. More importantly, her career trajectory remained completely unaffected by the confrontation. She received her promotion on schedule, was given increasingly important assignments, and continued to build an impressive record of service. The incident that Admiral Hawthorne had intended to derail her career had instead demonstrated exactly why she deserved every opportunity the Navy could offer. Years later, when Sarah had achieved the rank of commander and was leading her own ship, she would sometimes share the story with young officers under her command. But she always framed it not as a tale of personal triumph, but as a lesson about the importance of maintaining professional standards even in difficult situations. "The Admiral thought he could embarrass me by asking an inappropriate question," she would tell them. "But what he actually did was give me an opportunity to showcase everything I was proud of about my service record." Sometimes the best response to unprofessional behavior is to demonstrate what professional behavior actually looks like. The story of Admiral Hawthorne's question and Lieutenant Martinez's response became legendary throughout the Navy, passed down from one generation of sailors to the next as a reminder that respect is earned through competence and character, not demanded through rank and intimidation. It served as both a cautionary tale for those in positions of authority and an inspiration for those who found themselves facing similar challenges. But perhaps the most important lesson from the entire incident was that Sarah Martinez had proven something that many people in the military already suspected: that true leadership isn't about using your authority to diminish others, but about using your skills and knowledge to elevate everyone around you. Her response to the Admiral's crude question had demonstrated not just her own character, but the kind of leader the Navy needed more of. The wardroom confrontation lasted less than 10 minutes, but its effects rippled through the military for years to come. It became a defining moment not just for the individuals involved, but for the ongoing evolution of military culture toward greater professionalism and respect for all service members regardless of gender or background. Admiral Hawthorne had asked about Sarah's body count, expecting to humiliate her. Instead, he had created a moment that would be remembered as a perfect example of how competence, professionalism, and quick thinking could triumph over prejudice and inappropriate behavior. Sarah's response had stunned everyone in the Navy, but for all the right reasons.